Hello, I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 6th edition of Resilience and Adaptation, a series of online conversations brought to you by 1014 and the American Council on Germany. We are delighted to be partnering with the Thomas Mann House in LA for today's event.
I'm Katja Wiesbrock-Donovan, Chief Officer at 1014. Each week, we're joined by experts from both sides of the Atlantic to talk about the pressing challenges that are emerging around the globe. The spread of COVID-19 has been a catalyst for public health, economic, and now societal crisis. It has intensified social cleavages and racial disparities. As we look at these three crises, we're delighted to welcome Jutta Allmendinger, a well-known German sociologist, and Bill Strickland, an American community leader who has developed models to help break down social inequalities. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you for the invite.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
Jutta Allmendinger is a professor of sociology at the Humboldt University in Berlin, and since 2007, president of the Social Science Research Center Berlin. She's a frequent commentator in the German media, and last year she was a fellow at the Thomas Mann House. Bill Strickland is a community leader from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. While he was in college, he founded the Manchester Craftsmen's Guild as an after-school program to teach disadvantaged children pottery. And he has never looked back. The Manchester Bidwell Corporation, as it is known, has become a model for training and mentoring in the United States and around the world. He has been recognized with numerous awards, including a MacArthur Foundation Genius Award. So before we start, we'd just like to remind everyone that the ACG and 1014 are both independent, non-partisan organizations. So the views expressed during this conversation are those of the two experts. Also, if you would like to ask questions, please use the chat function on Zoom. You can also send an email to Steve at sokol@acgusa.org. We will do our best to fold your questions into the conversation.
There is a connection between the pandemic and the current uptick in social upheaval in the United States. Even without the images of police brutality, African Americans have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. A high number of African Americans work in the service sector, where massive numbers of jobs have been lost. The COVID-19 mortality rate is 2.4 times as high among Black Americans as it is white Americans. Bill Strickland, dealing with racism and social inequity is nothing new for you. As a matter of fact, your career has focused on combating racism and providing opportunity. Starting with pottery and mentoring for disadvantaged youth, Manchester Bidwell has become a model for initiatives in other parts of the country and around the world. Can you tell us a little bit about how your work has been impacted by the pandemic?
Yes, the people I work with are largely economically disadvantaged, largely African American, and before the pandemic, were suffering from the effects of poverty on obesity, stress, mental health issues, diet problems, obesity, etc. And so the pandemic has just exacerbated and brought to our attention the underlying circumstances that these people live with every day. And the people that come to my school fit that category and have fit that category for decades. And so it has just further accelerated our intensity in trying to find remediation strategies for that constituency. And in the 14 centers that we built around the world, the same demographic applies. So it's not just Pittsburgh, it's now quite literally around the world.
So looking at this combined challenge, right? The public health crisis that we're in, the economic crisis, the increased awareness about racial and social inequity. Do you think that we've reached an inflection point?
I hope so. Let me put it that way. The dramatic public response, including Germany, by the way, in which there were tens of thousands of people literally marching in the street as a result of Mr. Floyd's death and so forth, and London, Switzerland, Austria, etc., I think has demonstrated an international focus on the problems of racism and poverty, etc., and has, I think, sensitized a lot of people to the absolute urgency of finding problems and solutions to those problems with now a more immediacy than might have been the case. So I remain cautiously optimistic that this, in fact, could be an inflection point. And I think the measure of this is whether or not we're able to affect public policy and corporate policy in this specific area.
And I think that issue of public policy and corporate policy is one that we'd like to get into a little bit later in our conversation. I'd like to turn to you, Jutta Allmendinger. Obviously, societies around the world are facing an unprecedented public health crisis. Interestingly enough, just today, a new study by the University Clinic in Düsseldorf and the AOK health insurance company was released that confirms that COVID-19 disproportionately affects those who are economically and socially disadvantaged in Germany. This is something that we've been reading about in places like the US and the UK for a while, but I think this is the first major report that confirms that in Germany, despite the strong social welfare net that exists. Can you talk a little bit about how the pandemic has exacerbated social cleavages in Germany?
Yes, it indeed has exaggerated social cleavages along professions. Just think about self-employed people, think about people who lost their job, think about people who work in part-time work, or think about people with or without children, or think about people, and Bill already pointed to them, who are homeless, rather than having people with a lot of space who do much better in this crisis. And think about people who have the technical facilities to engage in homeschooling for their children, and those who do not have those technical equipment, students as well. I mean, all over it has increased social cleavages and has pointed to many areas where we didn't do our housework over the last couple of decades. So we did not engage enough in digital education. We did not engage enough into schooling, which sort of treats all children equally. We did not engage in, and this is now a social security point as well, that in particular self-employed people have enough resources to survive 3 or 4 months or even more than that.
And can you talk a little bit about how these social imbalances play out in society? How do they reveal themselves?
Well, if you think back, or if I think back, having lived in Germany over the entire time in the crisis, social trust was intense. So solidarity was intense. And what we have seen is that young people who really had to step back, who could not leave their houses, who couldn't meet their friends, and it was hard for them. They couldn't go to universities, to school. Small children couldn't go to their childcare facility. They showed an extreme solidarity toward the elderly, who were much more likely to get corona than the young ones. Think about people with children who showed a lot of solidarity towards those without children. Think about self-employed people, who also, stayed at home, although they have no financial means. So this solidarity, which we have had at the beginning over the first couple of weeks, now seems to disappear a little bit because people are now exhausted. They can't live their lives anymore. In particular, young mothers really suffer, and we'll probably get back to this problem later. And in particular, people having been out of school for a long time will suffer not just in the short run, but in the long run as well. And probably this may be a topic for further conversations as well. So what we see with our data is that people think, and asked about their own behavior, that they are very solidaric still, but that other people's solidarity declines. So this is a clash in the perception between own behavior and the behavior of others, which makes us think how it will continue.
Thank you so much. So if I might chime in here and focus a bit more on the solidarity you've mentioned, and what you just described as an effect that's now a little bit petering out. Both of you have mentioned that the Corona crisis has magnified these social inequities in our society, with disparities running along racial, socioeconomic, and probably also gender lines. We'll get to that later. You know, we have the slogan, we're in this together. So Jutta Allmendinger, you have expressed previously your hope that the pandemic will bring greater caring and democracy within Germany. So does this slogan, we're in this together, still ring true despite the effect of waning solidarity that you just described? Has the pandemic a unifying effect after all?
Mm-hmm. Well, it all depends on how you define in this together. What we have seen is indeed a strengthening of family ties. So families are in themselves together still. The major problem which I see now is that those different arenas of families don't have close ties together. So, and this of course is what a society makes up. And it's up to the civil society, it's up to politics, it's up but also to the economy to bring people together and that and to show that we are in the same boat. And what we are seeing right now are a lot of measures taken, a lot, but they are primarily short-term measures. So it will all depend what's happening in the next couple of months or years to come. And Bill has been pretty optimistic, or at least, you know, he showed signs of optimism. I'm not sure whether I share this optimism, whether we will get back or whether we'll make this big jump to a more equal society. I'm much more pessimistic and think that more inequalities will stay with us.
Just one follow-up before we then turn to you, Bill. Jutta Allmendinger, so when you say, okay, short-term measures, and you're not so sure if that will feed into long-term measures, if you could think about these possible long-term measures, and you've mentioned, you know, it's up to politics, society, economics to bring people together and create a unity. Who do you think are the most important actors? Is it us, society, or do you look at the political arena or at
Both.
At the industry? Maybe you follow up, Jutta, and then I have a question for you, Bill.
Well, in my case, the only significant resources that we can look to get the capital that we're going to need to build the educational institutions in partnership with corporations is public policy. In the United States, we've turned on the printing presses and we are making monopoly money. By the trillions. So it's not a question of whether we can manufacture the stuff. The issue is going to be whether we can couple that with an investment strategy that provides career enhancing opportunities for people who have been deprived. And to that extent, I think if we can get the right political leadership in place, I think that plus enlightened corporate leadership could really create literally a Marshall Plan for the rehabilitation of the United States of America, which would include a rehabilitation of our public education system, which I believe is at the point of no return if we don't address that in a very direct way.
Do we need a Marshall Plan for Germany as well, or for Europe, Jutta? What do you think?
Well, I mean, I very much highlight what Bill just said. I think that education will be the crucial point. That probably 20%, if not more, of the people have long-term damage because they haven't been at school for many, many months. And there are no serious efforts to give them, like you have in the US, in some parts, primarily for the privileged people, summer schools for the unprivileged people to try to make it up or something like this. So a lot of things have to be done in this sector. But I also think that temporarily things have tremendously improved, like for the homeless people who have been assigned to hotels. Because the hotels did not have any customers, because the tourists couldn't enter. So I would like to see some evaluation whether or not the stigma on homeless people is true, that they can't live in an apartment. I mean, this is what you usually say, they don't want to have their space of their own. And if we do this very seriously, then indeed, you know, we could come up with another social system which treats people more equally and more according to their needs. And whether this will be a Marshall Plan or not, I think it's a combination of many, many different points in many different areas. And of course, I would add the situation of women in this picture and the situation of old people in this as well.
Well, I think Chancellor Merkel is leading the way, by the way, as an example of the kind of world leadership that we all should follow, including in the United States. She is my heroine, and I have admired her tenacity and this worldview that she has brought without hesitation to Germany. But I think your country, in terms of its ability to embrace others and difference, is really a model that we all can learn from.
Yeah, it always is interesting for me that when I visited the Thomas Mann House last year, I mean, everybody thought in these terms as well. But of course, you have to acknowledge, being a citizen of Germany, that I see a lot of more inequalities, or I have many ideas how you can make the society better than it is now. Sure. I accept the view and it's fine, but it always refers to the reference points which you have. And I have another one.
I agree.
I'd like to maybe fold in a viewer question or two right here. We talked a little bit earlier about whether or not this is an inflection point, and heard perhaps the slightly more optimistic tone from Bill Strickland and maybe a slightly more pessimistic tone from Jutta Allmendinger. But one of our viewers asks, how many generations are needed to bring social change? 4 generations or more? And I guess the question I would add to that is, at what point does the clock start? Are we starting now, or can we say that we're part of the way through the process?
I think that the clock has already started. And that's the viewpoint that I bring to this conversation, because I specialize in that constituency that has been left out for generations. I believe with the right leadership and the right corporate leadership, we literally can turn this thing around, this momentum, in 1 or 2 generations. I don't think I'm not doing this for my grandchildren. I'm actually doing it for myself and my children. And I believe with all my heart that there is the capability to do this in a couple of generations.
And Jutta, what are your thoughts on the time horizon that we're looking at?
Well, I'm not sure whether it's a matter of generations. We know from many crises that crises trigger societal change much, much more than the succession of generations do. So we have seen it in many different situations of a crisis that they show, you know, what needs to be done to come forward to a better world. So probably this is it's a tragic point to say this, that it needs a crisis, that it needs, you know, some sort of outside intervention to make us move. But this is what empirical studies show, and in this respect, I'm not all too negative. Of course, in terms of digitalization, which has been poor in Germany in the educational system, but in other areas as well, or in terms of climate change, you know, we have seen that something needs to be done urgently. So I can't tell you how many generations it will take, but I know that it's a very it sounds very sarcastic, I know this, but it's a welcome starting point and a highly necessary one.
Well, and to add, in my view, all of this young people around the world who are demonstrating because of the police brutality that we all saw, in my view, can be organized into a global strategy for change. I view that as an extremely positive inflection point. And as you know, or maybe you don't know, I intend to build a global strategy for change, harnessing these young people as part of the workforce that will get this done.
Yes. I mean, this is the most important point, I think, that we have to form global alliances,
Yes, absolutely.
work towards one goal, and not, you know, a national one. And we have seen during Corona more nationalistic parts of, you know, we increased the borders and didn't allow people from other countries to get through, even not from European countries. And what it's needed that you give a voice to those people. And this needs to be an international, a global thing. I'm very much with you, Bill, on that. But yeah.
Thank you. So may I chime in with another viewer's question on this? So both of you talked about we need a change in public policy combined with economic plans sort of to overcome these cleavages. So the one viewer asked, the United States and Germany are both federal systems with highly decentralized systems. And the social safety net in the United States, for example, is largely left to local governments. In Germany, state governments matter a lot. So do these decentralized systems weaken the German and the United States' ability to recover and to produce these plans that you've talked about? Or is it a strength? Will these decentralized systems actually help to provide the answers that we need to overcome these crises?
Well, I believe that all politics is ultimately local. And I think that the change has got to come from the ground up, not the top down. And by that, I mean all of the people who have been disaffected and in many cases had their voting rights taken away, we need to be able to establish a strategy to get them engaged in the solution and not just a representation of the problem. If we can do that, all of the social institutions, policing, education, etc., get to be a part of that dynamic solution. And I think that if you think of it from the bottom up rather than the top down, you are building in a constituency that is invested in the outcomes. And I think getting them invested in the outcomes is part of the solution of this problem. It's a lot of work, but it is possible.
I more or less agree with Bill on that. In Germany, it has created a lot of confusion that one state behaves differently and took other measures than another state. It was a lack of communication, I think. So if we behave differently in different states, then we have to communicate why we do so. Now, as to the virus, we all know that it spreads locally. So of course, you know, we have to take local measures. At the same time, it's extremely expensive. So you also need to have federal money for this. So it's not an either local or federal. Those two areas need to work together very, very tightly and not use a situation of crisis for gaining voters' votes. This was not the most the best moment. Some politicians tried to bring them ahead as the next chancellor, for example.
But Jutta, I would build on your point by arguing the economics of the matter. In Pennsylvania, for example, it costs $40,000 a year to lock people up in the penitentiary. It costs $17,000 a year to send them to my training center. And we get 80 to 90% of those people going to work in industry. And in 3 years, they pay back the investment that was made. So I think that there is an economic argument that can be developed that really says by investing in people who are once considered liabilities, we can turn them into assets on the social balance sheet and save an awful lot of money and turmoil and social upheaval in the process.
So Bill,
No disagreement on that.
so I was just going to say, so Bill, let's stick with that sort of thought for a moment. And can you talk a little bit more about the role of education in moving people from the liability side of the equation to the asset side of the equation, and some of the things that you've actually been doing at Manchester Bidwell to try to help people in that process?
Well, I think the medicine is hope. That's the cure for cancer of the human spirit. And that, in my view, that's why I won the MacArthur Award, because I figured out the cure for cancer of the human spirit. You build world-class facilities with world-class faculty and partner with world-class companies and make it local. And you can turn this conversation around in very dramatic form. For example, one of our centers is in Akko, Israel, for Arabs and Jews. And it's been operating now for almost 7 years with a standing room only crowd, and is becoming a model for education in Israel with a group of people that were disregarded, and people thought they would never figure out a way to cooperate. Well, they have successfully, and the center is thriving, and we may be building one in Tel Aviv, and there's also some conversation about building one in Haifa. So here's a center that is operating on the same principles that we built in Pittsburgh with Arabs and Jews in Israel. And they've responded to technology the same. They're turning themselves into assets rather than liabilities. And we were able to present this program to the AIPAC group, which is the largest group of Jewish advocates politically in the world. In Washington, D.C., 18,000 people, and we received a 5-minute standing ovation from 18,000 people who thought this made sense. So if we can pull it off in Israel, the rest of the world is downhill from there.
Both in the United States and in Israel, though, how has your collaboration been with the political elite, if you will? One of our viewers is saying that much of what you're talking about requires long-term thinking, long-term planning, and many politicians are thinking only in terms of their next election cycle and their re-election.
What I've been able to figure out is a way for them to get the notoriety that they live for by taking credit for things that we have developed, often in partnership with them, but we try to do it in a way that gets immediate return, so that, and politicians like immediate returns on their investment. And so we are constantly in a public relations manner that allows them to see the returns on their political investment in measurable outcomes. For example, our classes graduate every 12 months, and we make it a big celebration. I stand in back of the camera, the politicians stand in front, and they like standing in front, and I like standing in the back. But Gandhi said, to lead the people, walk behind them.
So, Jutta, I'd like to turn to you to talk a little bit about education as well. Obviously, education plays a huge role in much of what we're talking about. You had mentioned earlier that when we were talking about the social cleavages and how they manifested themselves, that part of it has to do with access to technology, being able to teach your kids at home, being able to work at home. Part of it has to do with education levels and the roles that people have in society. Do you see improvements that can be made in the area of education that would help us deal with things like the current pandemic?
Yes, thank you. Let me probably first elaborate a little bit on Bill's returns to education. I think I'm now highlighting exactly those points which he highlighted before, but I would like to do this more explicitly. Those are not just returns in terms of labor force participation and productivity. There are huge sort of impact of education on the possibility to trust in other people. There is a huge correlation between education and resilience, a huge correlation between education and self-reliance, all those things which we need in times of uncertainty, in times of huge and rapid change. So I would like to just expand the picture of what education does and what missing education disables people to do. So this was just an elaboration of what Bill already said. Now, coming to your question, I think that we still work under the assumption that there are the school buildings and all people walk to the school, have their schooling, walk back. But we have a lot of migrant families who do not speak German, who do not know the German school system. And we at the same time know exactly which students are under the danger of falling behind because they already started from a much lower point in terms of their competencies. So we have to bring teachers to the parents. We have to bring teachers to the homes and pick children up and treat unequal opportunities in an unequal way so that people who need education more than others. My son had a high school degree even before he was born, actually, because this is how the German system works. But his best friends coming from a Turkish family background, showing the same achievement level than my son did, didn't. I mean, they didn't get the high school diploma. So, and we have to cope with this. We have to put much more resources in those poor areas. And now turning to Corona, what do we see? We see that there are some schools with 25% of teachers above the age of 60, and they were not allowed to teach. It's quite an uneven distribution of the age of teachers across schools. We have an extreme difference across schools in terms of digitalization education. Some tried it, others already knew it, some even didn't dare to put on work with this. We had some schools which even in part asked their students in, others didn't at all. But altogether, we did not show a lot of innovations. We did not ask the students, most of them lost their work in gastronomy or in other sectors, to go to the parents, help them out, help the students to work. This was not even thought or discussed in Germany. So in many, many areas, we did very well. I agree with Bill. So I'm not the most pessimistic person who says, well, Germany was doing an entirely bad job. But there are specific areas where we could have done much more, and by doing more, preventing in particular middle and long-term effects on this period of no schooling for the lives of those children. You do not see those effects right now. You will see them in 10 years or in 15 years, because those children will not have the ability to cope with crisis, to stay with this example.
Jutta, let me ask you two quick follow-up questions. One of them is a viewer question, and it has to do with wanting to know how Germany addresses family literacy. So not just school for school children, but literacy of adults as well. And then the second question is, since you talked about it before, that Germany has been behind in digitalization. Can you talk a little bit more about the digital divide in education and how that sort of gap is trying to be closed at the moment?
Well, yes, the first question is an extremely good and very, very important question in the German context, because we do not really deal with parents' literacy. I mean, this is not the major point. They have to take some classes before they come to Germany, and some employers enforce it, but others don't. But we do not put enough effort in this. This has to be, well, increased by far. I mean, there are very, very tiny, small roots to this. The second question on digitalization, we know by OECD rankings that Germany is way below the median of having developed digital ways of teaching, both in universities and in schools, or even smaller. I was in 1994, I was with my small son in Stanford, and he was educated a lot with digital means, having to learn Spanish with this and English with that, and I was paralyzed because I thought, oh, this is way too much for a 5-year-old kid. But he loved it. He took it very, very easily, and it helped him, you know, to cope with a different level of his starting point vis-a-vis other children who already knew Spanish. They didn't know German in first. So we have to see that digitalization and an individualized education can help people. It's not, you know, an either or. We have to combine it with face-to-face interaction, no question about this. But we have to go this way, and we also have to think about the connection between corona crisis and climate crisis, so that we carefully envision new ways in which, in part, you can work at home, having not to take, you know, the car to drive to whatever employer. But it all needs to be balanced. And I also hope that I do not have to fly to 2-hour meetings in the United States and fly back home, but that I can do this in a digitalized way. And those are some examples of what I hope that it will stay in the future as well. And then we also, of course, and I talked about this earlier, we really have to take seriously that not all students have the technical equipments. And we in Germany forgot this at the beginning. When we talked about online teaching, there was no mention on this, so whatever. So, but primarily we need the trust that digital education can be extremely helpful, in particular to making up and filling differences across different people.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so maybe we switch gears here and take a closer look at the gender dimension of the crisis, particularly as we begin to emerge from lockdown and start the process of reopening our economies. And Jutta, you have pointed out that it's important to take the perspectives of families and women into account when deciding about when and how to reopen our communities. What or should women be concerned about right now?
Well, women are extremely, well, we have to distinguish between women and women with small kids. I mean, I'm not talking about all women, I'm not talking about all men. What the WZB has researched in other non-universities as well, or university research, is how families cope with the corona and how this differs the way they look forward to their future economic life and their future enrollment in the workforce. And what we have seen so far is that there's a huge divide between people with and people without children, or people with children but grown-up children, I should say. And of course, given that school was closed, that there were no childcare facilities, parents in general had to do a lot of homeschooling. They were sports teachers, they were music teachers. They suddenly had to be the best friends of their children, had to entertain their children at the same time. They had to do work. I mean, they were employed and were in home office. And those burdens, I mean, 10 burdens at the same time, and also taking care of the elderly, of course, hit young mothers much, much more than young fathers. So the gender divide, which we already have, is much more women working part-time and much more men, or more or less all men, working full-time, harmed families, because men had this wonderful argument saying, well, I can't step down in my workload because on my income, the entire household depends. And so women withdraw their labor force experience significantly. So they reduce the work hours, they increase the unpaid hours in the families. And this again is a short-term development, but it has long-term effects, because their re-entry in the labor force will not be very easy. In my field, in academics, it means that women could not cope with their qualification work. They couldn't finish their PhD, and we did a lot of studies on this area. So they lost time, of which we do not know whether they can make it up, or whether this leads to a decision that they have to leave academia at all. Other women have problems re-entering the workforce because their children feel now unable to go back to school, because they increase the anxiety and their way of coping with other children. So there's a lot of research by now on this as well. And then other long-term effects for those mothers are, of course, lower pensions and a higher dependency on men, which, of course, we wanted to overcome during the last centuries, actually. Now, the most pressing question is what can be done about this. And here I think that we simply have to ask men to live a life which is much, much closer to the lives of women, rather than saying women have to adapt the life courses of men working full-time for their entire life. And so it needs to have a change of the entire labor market policy in terms of hours worked and social policy as well.
Thank you so much. And Bill, I'm just wondering, in your work, do you have similar concerns? Do you observe any gender disparities within your constituency when you deal every day to overcome these struggles that we're in right now?
No, mainly because I'm the CEO of the place, and I have declared that women are going to be leading the conversation, not following the conversation. And so the leadership of the institution determines public policy. And I think that we have decided in our organization, and in fact, all the centers that we built, that women are a significant part of the solution, not a significant part of the problem. And by getting the leadership to declare that that is going to be the culture of the educational institution, I think you can create solutions instantaneously by having the right leadership with the right value proposition, and we can eliminate this problem without lawyers, without a seminar, without white papers, or any of this stuff. Culture drives behavior.
That's absolutely true, and this is the reason why women in power lost a lot of power. So they had to step back from leadership positions. We have seen it several times during the last 4 months. And it's a pity, and it shows that we did not make enough progress over the last couple of decades.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, we ought to let the women take over, because the men have not done a great job so far. And I would be fine if women ran all the governments of the world. I think we could all learn something, including men.
Well, in Germany, probably you still work under the assumption that men, by definition, do the better job.
Well, that's a subject of much debate.
Well, let me jump in though, and just quickly ask both of you, do you think that, I mean, we talked earlier about whether or not this is an inflection point when it comes to inequity. Do you think that the corona crisis can bring greater gender equity with it?
I was the first one who thought like this, actually. Immediately when the pandemic entered the homes, I said, well, no, look, this is fantastic, because now both men and women are at home, and they both have to care for their children, and they both have to go shopping. And so this is now the big crossing point for greater gender equity. But I guess I was wrong of this. At least all empirical data proved me wrong.
Well, one of the things I've learned, a therapist friend of mine pointed out to me that the largest industry in China, aside from the amelioration of poverty, are divorce lawyers, because apparently the people who are now required to spend time with their spouses don't like them. And so they've hired lawyers to figure out how they can separate because they don't like who they married, which I found was a very interesting social outcome and a side outcome for the pandemic.
That's an outcome of the pandemic, but I'd just like to take one step back and say, okay, you know, I understand women should be part of the solution and take on leadership roles. But if you look at the essential workers, you know, many of them women, you know, what they're doing right now, they have received a lot of applause for serving in the front lines, in grocery stores, hospitals, and elsewhere. But would it perhaps be time now to value their work as well in terms of pay and benefits and improved working conditions?
Yes,
and not just, I mean, as nice as it is to receive applause and flowers, you know, maybe we could take it from here and fold it into our policy wishes to say that we need to value these kinds of works as well.
Well, I think public policy could have a very big impact on this by literally changing the wage rates of the people who have been most discriminated against, starting with women. I believe that we could do something in terms of the hourly rates, particularly for the most vulnerable. And if we have a second, I'd like to talk to you about a program I've run for 20 years with a very famous German company named Bayer. We built a chemical tech program for the dispossessed in Pittsburgh that's now become a national model of how to take endangered populations, economically disadvantaged, half of whom were women, and putting them into a Fortune 100 company, and done this in a sustainable way. So it can be done, and it can be done on a sustained basis.
Well, I just wanted to highlight that many of those, in particular women, whether they work in hospitals or whether they work in supermarkets, worked without any health protection. So this was really an extremely risky job with very, very poor pay. So we have to work on two ends here. We, of course, have to be better prepared for a second pandemic or health crisis so that we have more health protection then, and I hope that the politicians will see this and behave like this. And the second is that we turn applause not just in one-term money, like those 300 euros or 1,000 euros, which they get at one point in time, but that we weight the importance of their professions against the importance of other professions, and then think about a new wage structure overall. And this is not just wage, it's also work conditions. You pointed this out, Katja, that those women primarily have to work long hours during night and have to work in terms and things like this. So it's not just pay, it's also time for themselves. It's everything. And when I go shopping now, and if I talk to nurses, they all told me that applause was wonderful for them, because usually over the decades, they thought that they even don't have a face, so that they were treated like nothing, like no one. Now they felt for a short period of time that they are seen as individuals, and that this is declining immediately now. I mean, if you go to supermarkets, you do not see a lot of, yeah.
I would argue that we ought to be able at this point to see the investment in programs like in the United States Head Start, which provided nutrition and safe educational environments for children, is an investment in the future. And I believe that one of the things that we should be able to do at this point is to make a good business case for investing in those people who have traditionally been considered liabilities. Investing in women, investing in families, investing in children gets a huge multiplicity of return on investment if we could only be able to understand that the investment on the front end will pay dividends on the back end. And I believe that the future of any enlightened corporation is going to be dependent on our ability and their ability to harvest this potential that so far has been squandered, in my opinion.
Yeah, but we also, in addition to this, have also to think about the wage structure of our occupations, which has to be remodeled. We also have to think about including self-employed people in our social security program, which we did not so far. So there are a lot of other tasks in addition to this Head Start, which I strongly endorse.
So as we're slowly coming to the end of the hour, I'd like to maybe close by asking you both a question that's sort of more forward-looking, and there are sort of two parts to it. We've obviously covered a lot of ground in our conversation so far, talking about the simultaneous public health, economic, and societal crises that are unfolding at the moment and that are taking their toll. I think all of us recognize that this is an unprecedented time, but it's also a call to action. And so I guess in your final comments, I'd be interested in hearing from each of you what the things are that we can do to try to move the process forward. We've talked a little bit about changes in public policy, changes in corporate policy, but what can we as citizens do? That would be one part of the question. But the other is, as you look forward, particularly in light of this point in history being an inflection point, what do you think might be different in June of 2021 from June of 2019? What might we expect to have changed, and how can we play a role in that change?
Well, I'll take a stab first. I want to harvest the energy of tens of thousands of young people around the world and see if we can create a movement for change. I believe they may end up being the solution that we've all been looking for, and create some kind of a national or international organization of leaders from these communities that were so dramatically in evidence as the result of Mr. Floyd's murder, and see if we can harness these young people and their energy and their enthusiasm, because I believe the fact that they have gone out into the streets, often at the peril of their own health, because of their conscience being sensitized to this tragedy that we experience in the United States, is by itself a cause for hope. These young people are hopeful. They're not there because they're angry. They're there because their conscience has been touched in a very profound way that has brought tears to not only my eye, but a lot of people in my generation who have looked back and said, the answer to our problem is in the mouths and the songs of these young people, and that needs to be harvested. And part of my plan is to create a continued movement to see if we can develop a structure that can bring this to fruition.
Well, I think that we have to fight for more equality more than we did previously, because we know that societies which have less inequality have more trust in each other. And what is needed, what is primarily needed in such times, is that people trust each other and feel some solidarity towards each other. It all depends on the people. And it's not just depending on politicians and economic and things like this. So but in order to do this, we have to invest much more energy to decrease very well-known inequalities in terms of education, but also in terms of gender and in terms of ethnic background. We know all those things. We also know the measures which we could take to decrease those differences, but we have to act. And therefore, I do not think that it's on the young people only. I think that we, that young parents have to form an alliance as well and to speak up. I know that in particular the young mothers who need most global voice don't have the time to speak up and don't have, the resources. So they always tell me, how should I do this? I mean, I'm fully occupied over the entire day, but we have to give them a stronger voice, and we all have to work on them as much as we have to do for the young children and other very disprivileged areas. And if you ask me what I think about 221, we are all working on this very much now, because we know that the state in June 221 all depends on what measures will be taken right now and how seriously we take the experience we went through over the last 4 months. And probably, there are countries who did very, very well, like Germany did, and they said, well, everything went fine, so why should we change something? But others where it didn't work out like this, do more, and this would not be the right response. So in Germany, we should keep up a good health system as we did. A lot of this was accidental, actually, because we wanted to decrease the number of hospitals. But at the other hand, there is a lot of room to move ahead.
I would add, for those who are on the call, this is not miracle work, it's hard work. And so I would counsel people that want to get involved with this stuff, take your time. It took a long time to create these unfortunate economic conditions. It's going to take sustained energy over a long period of time to begin to get measurable results.
That's true.
So let's hope that we do all muster this energy to turn this crisis into opportunity and into change for the better, as you laid out. And so let me thank you both, Jutta Allmendinger and Bill Strickland, for joining us today for this very lively discussion. We've really enjoyed it immensely. And on behalf of the 13 and the American Council on Germany, big thank you to you. We look forward.
Nice to meet you. I'll come to visit you in Germany after the pandemic.
Yes, so hopefully we'll get together in person soon. But so as until we get there, we're grateful for the opportunity to speak like this with both of you today.
Thank you.
Well, thank the two of you for bringing me together with Bill. I highly appreciate this. And probably you could meet us in Berlin. The social center is always open. Or I go back to Pittsburgh, where I've been before.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Well, thank you both again, and thank you to our viewers for joining us and for participating with your many questions. We hope you'll join us next week on Tuesday at 11 o'clock. We'll talk about climate and the environment during the pandemic. And we wish you all well. Until next time, stay healthy, everybody. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.